The 2017 IFANS Conference on Global Affairs will begin shortly. Please make your way into the conference hall and be seated. Also, as a reminder, please silence all portable electronic devices and take note that taking photographs during the conference is prohibited.
Good afternoon. My name is Yoon Young-kwan, Professor Emeritus of Seoul National University. And it is my great privilege to have the opportunity to chair this panel composed of very distinguished panelists and also before the distinguished audience. We have been discussing the North Korean nuclear program seriously this morning and this early afternoon. And we have another session 3, which will focus on the solution, how to solve this problem. The previous session, as I understood, focused on the intention, capability, and the strategy of North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. And while we are supposed to focus on solution aspect, but as you know, it is difficult to strictly limit our discussion on that subject, but I hope we can focus more on the solution side rather than other related subjects. And we have about 90 minutes. Actually 100 minutes originally, but I think the next sessions, dinner session and all the schedule, considering all those schedules after this session, I would like to limit our discussion to about 90 minutes or something like that. And I would like to provide each panelist probably 5 to 7 minutes maximum. And please try to keep the time, and then we may have some opportunity to exchange our views among the panelists and then open to the floor so that the audience can take part in discussion. So first, Dr. Jeon Bong-gun, mic is yours.
Thank you. We have come a long day, beginning with some general ideas about the North Korean nuclear issues and some North Korea analysis of North Korea's intentions and the policies. And I think this 5 or 7 minutes is a little bit too short to discuss these solutions of the DPRK nuclear problem that somehow we have failed to solve during the last 27 years. But I'm glad to share some of my analysis and some of my observations on these issues. The question that I raised for this session is that now we have a new kind of initiative about peace regime building, but will it be successful this time after decades of a failed denuclearization and the peace settlement diplomacy? That is the question. I think that is a question that has been raised today all the time, especially as we are seeing the situation. Everybody was saying that the DPRK seemed to be okay, despite all these sanctions and that their nuclear armament is making good progress. And how can we achieve our denuclearization and the peace settlement effort? That is really the big question. And I will come up with some of my diagram that I played out that you might see also in the booklet. This is a very simple diagram, but I think it may show us how do we see the situation and what kind of choices do we have in the near future. I'm just projecting a couple years ahead, 3 to 5 years. We have a lot of scenarios. This morning we have come up with a lot of scenarios and policy options. I just squeeze all of them in this one diagram. On the bottom line, this horizontal is DPRK's positions, and this vertical is our policies toward DPRK. I assume that we are probably near A, and we may be pushing toward B at the moment. And I'm assuming that within a few years, we just stay in current course of actions, we may come up with a B scenario where there will be a balance of terror or maybe a balance of terror. There will be DPRK's nuclear armament will be complete, and probably we will have a much stronger extended deterrence, but I assume there will be very serious arms race and the world crisis, very chronic world crisis. And also there will be very high possibility of a kind of accidental war on that situation. And then if that is too scary, people are today, or maybe in some newspapers, in the media, people are saying that why don't we live with a nuclear North Korea? There is another scenario E, accepting a North Korea nuclear for the moment, if we do not accept as a nuclear weapon status. But however, we should be ready to live with nuclear North Korea. That's what people are saying. But are we ready to live with nuclear North Korea when we saw such a DPRK's risky behavior and adventurous behavior? And in that situation, people may say that why don't we just South Korea go nuclear, so that there will be some nuclear balance. But and also another situation might be that there will be some DPRK, U.S. Some agreement, and the U.S. May withdraw their forces because they don't want to put their forces within this harm's ray of DPRK's nuclear threat. So there is a scenario E. But I don't think that's very much it's like going to happen, because we are going to deny it, and the U.S. will deny it. And then what options do we have? People want to say, why don't we just return to our old sanctions policy, and it's more like a D scenario. This is what I'm calling a forced denuclearization. How do we force denuclearize? By strong sanctions and containment, the DPRK may voluntarily give up. That has been our assumption during the last decades. It didn't happen. And if it doesn't happen, why don't we just pursue a regime collapse approach or regime change approach? Why not the preventive attack? But this kind of forced denuclearization is a highly improbable and highly impossible option for us. Then we are left with scenario C. Then people are saying, maybe say that this is a peace regime building. This is it's like returning to our, this six-party talk framework, where we are going to have this denuclearization and normalization of diplomatic relations between U.S. and DPRK, inter-Korean relations, and there will be six-party or regional security cooperation framework. So when we are seeing this scenario that's going to happen within a few years, I think we may come up with a certain consensus among here that B is too dangerous, D is improbable, impossible, E is unacceptable. Then we may have to choose the C. But the problem here is that we have tried that for decades. Then my answer to that is that I think though C might be the least likely scenario for the moment, I think we have to choose it, because otherwise other options are too dangerous, two scenarios are too dangerous. Then how do we proceed with this scenario C? I have a couple of some opportunities. During the time we have discussed that DPRK is Byungjin line is successful and the DPRK economy is okay. But I'm going to say there is a couple of opportunity factors that we should focus on it. We should watch on it, and we should be able to utilize them. Here is a couple. First, at the moment, we are having much stronger sense of urgency. it's not like years ago when we have a little bit of time. And especially when we are watching this diagram, there is much heightened sense of urgency. Secondly, with the hydrogen bomb test and the ICBM test, DPRK has catalyzed much stronger US-China joint reactions. Previous DPRK's test, if I compare those with this ICBM and the hydrogen bomb test, I think there is some qualitative differences. So these two recent DPRK provocations is what I call it a so-called Clausewitzian culminating point of attack. So when by DPRK pushing forward and bypassing this point, I think US is about to react much vigorously. And also China is in the same way. China is now feeling DPRK is a challenge, it's a sole nuclear weapon status in the region. And China is feeling the heat. It might be involved in a war in the Korean Peninsula, which China has wanted to avoid so long, so hard. And also US was now seeing it as a direct threat to himself. And also, I see there is a Trump opportunity factor. Everybody in the room may think Trump is a threat factor, but I somehow see some opportunity factor here. Trump has said that there is no more strategic patience. That's a good point. And he has maintaining a very high priority approach to DPRK nuclear issues. That's good. And also he's open to summit with Kim Jong-un. And his government is come up with a 4-no approach that it's ready to recognize the DPRK regime and system as it is. And also, US is ready to sacrifice some of its trade interest with China in order to induce China to come up with a much stronger sanctions against the DPRK. And finally, I can see also there is some problem in the DPRK. Everybody was saying that the Byungjin is okay. Byungjin DPRK parallel approach line is okay. But I can see Byungjin line is under some serious stress. They are supposed to say that by having nuclear weapons, they are having much stronger security and a much stronger economy. But when I see it, when DPRK increased its nuclear arsenal or nuclear their capabilities, they might encounter much stronger South Korean, US-Korean alliance responses. We are showing a lot of our demonstrations. We are demonstrating a lot of our muscles in the South Korea and the US. And also, Kim Jong-un told their people that while we spend money on the nuclear armament, then we can save some money for the traditional weaponry. Then we'd put all this money for the development of their economy. But that's not going to happen. That's not going to happen. As they are increasing their nuclear capabilities, there is a much, much stronger international sanctions. I think the DPRK is feeling some hit at the moment. So all these factors somehow are maybe turning toward our favor this year, and I believe that it's going to be much accelerate in coming months. So I would see that while during the time DPRK was making some progress in their own terms, but I believe that now the environmental situation is maybe turning against the DPRK. So I hope that this is a very high time for us to push forward our own agenda and push it for them, DPRK, to come to the negotiating table. Thank you. I better stop it.
So you're basically, supporting, what is your, in your paper, you explained Moon Jae-in government's approach, freeze first idea, and are you also recommending that as your solution, or are you supporting President Trump's CVID at once approach?
I think U.S. and Korea are more on the same page on this moment. Of course, the CVID, a complete dismantlement, is our ultimate goals. But the more practical approach at the moment, as was said in the earlier session, we need small balls. So probably suspension for suspension or some temperature, some freeze or freezer. That kind of early steps could be a must and necessary. What I would call is a mini package deal. Mini package deal, where the DPRK is a suspension of their nuclear test and ultimately freezing their nuclear material production. And we may be ready to reciprocate some of our measures towards them.
Okay, thank you very much. Dr. Halperin?
So let me try to build on that presentation, make a few points that I think have not been made so far. I think it is very important that we take the notion that there's an option called preventive war off the table. The South Korean government has done that. Your president has spoken very clearly about that. The American government has not yet done so, and I think it needs to do so for two reasons. One, it is not an option. We are not going to do it. And it makes the world more dangerous because it increases the risk of an inadvertent war between the U.S. and the DPRK out of their fear that we're about to implement this policy of preventive war. And second of all, because it will clear the minds of the U.S. government and as well as the Korean government that we need a different solution. And that solution, as the chart, I guess it's gone, but showed, the only real option that enhances our security is a negotiated agreement which moves us towards denuclearization. And I think that in order to get there, we need to do less wishful thinking, less trying to guess what the DPRK will say, and ask how we can change our own negotiating positions so that as to maximize the chances that the DPRK will over time agree to an agreement which leads over time to the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. And I think we need to think about that both in terms of the short-term negotiation and the long-term. Let me talk about the long-term first. We need, I believe, to lay out much more clearly and comprehensively It says there's an emergency alert. We need to lay out a vision that we have for a comprehensive security structure in Northeast Asia, which will respond to the security concerns of the DPRK as well as the Republic of Korea and the United States and the other participants in the six-party talks. And that involves, as a number of us have been talking about now for many years, an agreement on a Northeast Asian Security Council, which deals with the regional security issues, the phasing out of the sanctions and the establishment of free economic relations between the six parties and all the others, a declaration of non-hostility, the end to the Korean armistice and the signing of a peace treaty with the appropriate set of countries for that purpose, an agreement on the provision of economic aid to the DPRK, and finally, the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. And I think it is an important step forward that we're now talking, both countries are talking about the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula rather than just of North Korea. But I think we ought to try to do two other things. One is to make it a broader region of Northeast Asia rather than just the Korean Peninsula. But second, to make it a legally binding instrument. That is, we are not simply talking about an agreement by which the DPRK gives up its nuclear weapons. We, I think, should be talking about a regional nuclear weapons-free zone, even if it's just the Korean Peninsula, which would mean that the legal obligation to not have nuclear weapons would be on both the DPRK and the ROK. And it means that the security guarantees and commitments not to threaten the use of nuclear weapons would be legally binding, and I think we would then take it to the Security Council and have the Security Council endorse it, so that you have not simply an agreement whereby the DPRK is giving up its nuclear weapons, but the agreement on creating a nuclear weapons-free zone with the security guarantees and the legal guarantees that go with that, which applies equally at least to the DPRK and the ROK, if not to other countries in the region as well. And let me just say a word about the short-term agreement. Here again, I think the United States says it's ready to negotiate, but it is only ready to negotiate, as far as I can tell, an agreement for the complete denuclearization of North Korea without anything offered in return. So that is not a very attractive negotiation to get the DPRK into. They are not going to agree. I think whatever differences we may have about predicting their behavior, they will not come into a negotiation whose purpose is to negotiate their denuclearization with nothing offered to them on the other side. So we need to have some kind of freeze for a freeze, but I think it needs to be not a total elimination of American military exercises. That, I think, is unrealistic. You could imagine one year of exercises, or maybe two, being foregone. But over time, we need to have an agreement on a set of restraints on American ROK military exercises, which involves, for example, not testing nuclear weapons, not testing decapitation, making other changes and adjustments to the agreement, in return for the DPRK agreeing initially on no testing of nuclear weapons and no testing of missiles. And I think, by the way, the notion that they would agree only not to test ICBMs is not only a very bad idea, but not one that, as far as I know, is being discussed very much. So I think we ought to understand that if there is going to be a DPRK freeze on missiles, it will be all missiles. They will try to make an exception for satellites, and we'll have to figure out a way to deal with that. But then we want them to agree to freeze the production of fissional material and the production of warheads, of missiles. That's going to take longer to negotiate because it involves agreed inspection, which guarantees that those conditions are being met, and we are going to have to figure out what to offer in return. But I think that second phase of the freeze discussion could go on ideally in parallel with the negotiation about what the terms are and should be for the final status negotiations, so that those can begin as we reach agreement on the second phase of the freeze, which involves the production freeze. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Hayes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to build on the remarks of Mort Halperin, who's laid out the building blocks of what we call Phase 1 and Phase 2 of the necessary engagement for coercive diplomacy to be effective. Coercive diplomacy involves coercion and diplomacy also requires engagement. So he's laid out the freeze and the dismantlement elements, the building blocks in Phase 1 and Phase 2 of a comprehensive security settlement, along with the other elements that he noted at an institutional level, and the inducements related to phased reduction of sanctions, provision of energy assistance, etc. And this would all take, at minimum, between 1 and probably 2 or 3 years to complete. But our argument is that really the big question is, what then? And why should the North Koreans agree to such tentative steps towards what they call ending US hostility? Now, the fact is we don't really know what North Korea means by ending US hostility. We did a study a few years ago where we found no less than 29 distinct meanings of ending US hostility in North Korean statements at particular junctures over 2 decades. And we have a new leader with in a new era, and ending US hostility could have new elements to it that we have not yet discovered because we're not talking to them. But from our perspective, it's clear that we need to outline in some detail for their consideration and processing and response and amendment in a negotiated approach, in a dialogue, through engagement, what exactly constitutes phase 3 of a settlement involving not just the freeze and the dismantlement of missiles and nuclear fuel cycle facilities, but the phased disarmament of their actual nuclear weapons, and when this would have to happen, and how it would be verified, and what mutual or reciprocal obligations the different parties undertake with respect to this incremental disarmament. Now, as Mort noted, there are really 2 ways to approach this. One is just a delimited inter-Korean or Korean Peninsula nuclear weapons-free zone in a legal treaty format, or you could attempt to do this in a broader context of a regional nuclear weapons-free zone. And of course, we have the experience of the 1992 Denuclearization Declaration to refer to, and we know that there were problems with just an inter-Korean denuclearization declaration because it did not have, in many respects, the full legal treaty status that's required from a North Korean perspective to give them a legally binding guarantee, not from South Korea, but from the United States, and from the United Kingdom, and from France, and from China, and from Russia, the NPT nuclear weapon states, that they will not use nuclear weapons to either threaten North Korea or to attack North Korea. We may just think that this is just American nuclear weapons that concern China, but in fact they are looking for a binding guarantee, and in our view, the only way to really deliver such a binding guarantee that would be durable over time is in a full-fledged nuclear weapons-free zone treaty in the multilateral UN format, which happens to be the format for a treaty agreement between North Korea and South Korea, which avoids the issue of competing claims of sovereignty over the entire peninsula that each side continues to assert, and that has blocked other inter-Korean commitments in the past. This approach also acknowledges the reality that the September 2005 principles have been superseded in certain respects, and that simply insisting that North Korea rejoin the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is a necessary but insufficient institutional framework for achieving North Korean disarmament. And the reason for this, well, there are multiple reasons that this is not a sufficient approach, institutional approach. First, as was noted by an earlier speaker, North Korea will need confidence over multiple political cycles in the United States and South Korea that whatever it's been offered as the ultimate outcome through this engagement to end nuclear threat and to end American hostility towards North Korea will actually survive those changes in administration. They would be irrational to not actually test the water before they jump in. Secondly, it will take physical time, it will actually take time to physically disarm North Korea. This can't just be done overnight. We have some experience with other states that have disarmed. We know what it will take. And until North Korea is fully disarmed, there is no actual mechanism in the NPT, in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, for North Korea to actually rejoin. You can't rejoin partially disarmed. Meanwhile, we have to manage North Korea's nuclear weapons and the nuclear threat even as it incrementally disarms. And we suggest that having North Korea join a nuclear weapons-free zone treaty and undertaking to come into compliance over time with the benefits that would come to North Korea calibrated to its disarmament performance against agreed milestones of disarmament over time, is a way to manage its nuclear threat until it is fully disarmed and comes back into full compliance with the NPT and into full compliance with the nuclear weapons-free zone treaty obligations it would undertake. And until that time, it would not get the full benefits of a nuclear weapon-free zone, but it would get a contingent benefit over time, a calibrated approach to delivery of the legally binding negative security assurance from the nuclear weapons states. And this can be defined in quite tangible and specific ways that are verifiable from a North Korean perspective, as well as from an American perspective as to how they perform, in terms of where and how we deploy, for example, nuclear-capable platforms in this region. This is something that can actually be done, including their access to American military facilities in South Korea on a reciprocal inspection basis. So there are some ways of actually proceeding down this path of incremental disarmament. It's very important in our view to shift the six-party talks focus, which is in the past focused solely on North Korea, to an institutional framework that actually treats North Korea on an equal basis with the other states in the region, with all the states in the region, rather than being the sole concern. Because a nuclear weapons-free zone at a regional level, as against merely an inter-Korean zone, would not only address North Korea's nuclear threat, but would require all states that are party to such a treaty to change how they manage nuclear threats and to be compliant with the obligations that they undertake with respect to each other, not just in relation to North Korea. And in that sense, it actually accords an equal status to the North Korean, but I want to point out it does not accept that their nuclear weapons are legitimate. It would acknowledge that their weapons exist, but the very act of the North Koreans joining such a treaty at the outset would be an admission that these weapons are illegitimate, because they would only be able to do so on the basis that they are giving them up. So we would not be accepting, we'd be merely acknowledging the reality that they have nuclear weapons and that we're now agreed on how, over time, they would actually disarm. I'd like to make a specific suggestion for South Korea's consideration at this juncture, which is that a first step along this road is to follow Ban Ki-moon's suggestion, I think it was in 2013, that the states of this region should convene an eminent persons group to actually examine in detail, for consideration at the six-party talks, when they resume as they must, how such a zonal concept would be tailored to the specific circumstances and imperatives of this region. The region itself would need to be defined in the course of convening such talks. Would it include Mongolia? Would it include Canada? Would it include South Korea and Japan only at the outset? But certainly North Korea would need to be party to it, certainly South Korea, and almost certainly Japan. Looking further down the road of disarmament, I also think that it would be timely, following on Ramesh Thakur's comments earlier, that South Korea examine now the pros and cons of deepening its own non-nuclear credentials in a nuclear weapon-free zone at the point at which North Korea has actually given up its nuclear weapons, of signing and ratifying the nuclear weapons prohibition treaty at the same time as the other parties to a Northeast Asia nuclear weapon-free zone. By explicitly eschewing or giving up nuclear extended deterrence as a nuclear prohibitionist rather than a nuclear umbrella state, and this could be 10 or 15 years down the line that this occurs, because it will take somewhere between 3 and 10 years to get to the point of North Korean nuclear disarmament through the creation of a nuclear weapons-free zone. South Korea may gain additional benefits at the peninsula, regional, and global level from prohibiting nuclear weapons in every dimension in its security posture at small or no cost to its own security, and requiring only small, if any, adjustments to its military forces and those of its allies and their shared command and control and early warning systems.
Would you please
But this is
wrap
for
up,
the
please?
future.
Wrap up, please.
Okay, I'll finish by saying two things. It's very clear that North Korea's nuclear threats are outrageous, opportunistic, and completely unjustifiable. They are a form of nuclear aggression, and they have no place in civilized discourse. It's equally clear that American signaling that North Korea is targeted with nuclear weapons, whilst it's more clinical, is equally lethal when it's not accompanied by a sincere or authentic approach to negotiation, is equally lethal to the prospects for tension reduction, dialogue, and resolution of the nuclear issue. Ms. Kim Jong-sun, who is a 27-year-old mother who was bombed with her baby at Nagasaki in 1945, told me 30 years ago here in Seoul, "From my experience, if nuclear war happens again, it would be better that all should be killed. Those remaining alive would all be crippled. I know because I have suffered it all. It is worse than dying." We should pay heed to Ms. Kim and take the road less traveled so far, because it's far more likely to lead to nuclear disarmament in Korea and beyond, rather than nuclear war at this time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think you have prepared very carefully thought and comprehensive roadmap for building peace structure on the Korean Peninsula. You don't have to answer to my question, but how would you persuade President Trump and Kim Jong-un to accept your roadmap? Please answer later. Yeah. Dr. Namgung?
Thank you very much, Minister Yoon. I think, we're accustomed to talking about North Korea as something for us to act upon rather than as an actor in its own right. We think of it as very vulnerable at all times, subject to sanctions. Are they going to collapse or not collapse? It's a regime, not a government. The list is long. We seldom stop to ask whether they might have a strategy of their own that we only dimly grasp, and whether a better understanding of that strategy might produce better results and better solutions, which is the purpose of this session. Rather than talk about multilateral solutions, which seems to me to be a matter of putting the cart before the horse, we need to talk about bilateral and trilateral solutions, which has been uppermost in the North Koreans' minds for many years, especially with the advent of the Kim Jong-un administration. And it is an administration. I don't think we should shy away from using such terms. Any government that has been standing for 70 years is, by definition, stable, in my view. There have been 3 occasions, very briefly, when China has done things in the region that have caused North Korea to turn towards South Korea to reach a political accommodation. The first time was when Nixon reached out to China. Kim Il-sung, for the first time at a mass rally, used the term Kongwadang, a Republican party, to refer to Park Chung-hee's party, and that he was prepared to talk to them. And as you know, we had Red Cross talks, and we had the 1972 South-North Agreement. In 1990, roughly, communism fell. China decided to normalize its relations with South Korea. And North Korea pushed for a South-North basic accords, as well as a South-North denuclearization accord, which, as we all know, went nowhere. But the point is that that activity on China's part prompted North Korea, in my view, to move in this direction. And now we're into a third opportunity at the moment, where North Korea is trying to open up something with the South, as a result of Chinese, the emergence of Chinese in the region, not just as a balancer or a stabilizer, but one that has pretensions to having superpower status along with the U.S., with which they, I think, hope in the future to pretty much take care of all kinds of global issues. And that's seen as a real challenge. So along with that, in the past 3 or 4 years, we've seen a slight shift in their emphases as a part of its turn to South Korea, that its objectives have slightly shifted, that with respect to its relations to the US, it's no longer peace treaty and normalization of relations. It's no longer the New York Philharmonic Orchestra and paying official condolences after 9/11 to the United States government, those kinds of gestures. It's more a matter of making sure that the US military doesn't attack, that it's a military pact that they're more interested in rather than a genuine improvement in relations and a new basis for friendship. The interest in South Korea, interestingly, is more in that of a peace treaty. The peace treaty is what North Korea needs from the South. A military non-aggression pact of some kind is what it needs from the US, and that's a significant shift that's taken place in the last several years. And the most striking example of this new kind of thinking, I invite you to take a look at a February 2012 Institute for Disarmament and Peace statement, which is a major declaration of Kim Jong-un's foreign policy. And let us say, once again, that he does have a foreign policy. And that is, in this document, which has not been given sufficient attention, there's several striking things that are said. One, all of North Korea's diplomatic achievements, whether it's the US DPRK joint communique of December 2000, whether it's the Pyongyang Declaration with Mr. Koizumi, whether it's the six-party talks, are all due to the success of the 2 inter-Korean summits. Now, stop and think about that for a moment. This is the foreign ministry stating that the success of all of North Korea's diplomatic activity is due to the success of the inter-Korean summits. Never before had such a statement ever been made, and certainly not coming from the foreign ministry. Number 2, a second characteristic of this is that the US's role is to encourage inter-Korean relations, to encourage the 2 Koreas to work with one another and to reach an accommodation, not to dictate the terms of the settlement, but to be a friendly, guiding force. And then thirdly, that the US should consider this redefined Korean Peninsula as a buffer zone. As a buffer zone. Buffer zone against what? Quite obviously, it's a buffer zone against regional challenges, principally among them the emergence of China. And then finally, this statement, which incidentally was drafted by one of North Korea's most senior diplomats, who is very active on the scene today. The fact that it is issued by the foreign ministry suggests a tacit acceptance of the notion of 2 separate states or near states on the Korean Peninsula, and that some North Korean diplomats call this a policy of realism, that there are 2 Koreas and they're here to stay for the time being. It may take 20 years, 40 years, 60 years. You know, we had 3 kingdoms on this peninsula at one time for several hundreds of years, but they're here to stay, and it's not going to do a whole lot of good to talk about Korea as one, and so on. So a truly remarkable document, and I would suggest it's a kind of governing statement for Kim Jong-un's foreign policy. Finally, there's absolutely no mention of China in this document, none whatsoever, as if it, along with Russia and Japan, really don't matter. Of course, and I now want to talk about Donald Trump's policy towards North Korea. What is his strategy towards North Korea? And as you know, it's been called maximum pressure and engagement. Basically to totally drive North Korea into a corner so that it surrenders and is forced to accept the US's terms for denuclearization. Interestingly, we have seen over the past 10 months, Mr. Trump moderating his view of this. So I think he began more by assuming that this is something that China could take care of in a heartbeat overnight. I think he assumed that if he just applied enough pressure on the young man, that he would give in. Over time, I think he's begun to understand that neither one is that easy to do, and he has moved away a little bit from that extreme position. If that policy of driving North Korea into a corner and making it surrender doesn't work, then he may be forced to take military action, as you know from the various public statements that he's made. However, and this is also very interesting, he seems to be prepared to go much further than his predecessors in terms of giving benefits to the North Koreans if they should cooperate with him. After this maximum pressure phase is over and North Korea decides it's in their best interest to give in, basically, he's prepared to be so much more generous than any of his predecessors who were offering, through the September 2005 joint statement or the U.S. DPRK joint communique or the 1994 agreed framework, certain benefits, but always sort of grudgingly. You committed a crime, you correct your behavior, and then we'll give you some things in return. His approach is a little different. It seems to be much more embracing, that if he can get Kim Jong-un to give up his nuclear weapons, then he's prepared to give Kim Jong-un a whole lot. And we can't be any more specific than that here, but as you know, Secretary Tillerson has stated publicly that there are two or three channels of communication between the U.S. and North Korea, and that diplomacy is active. I believe that was the term he used, and he said that for a very specific reason, because it has been active. It just hasn't been visible. And then, of course, if that kind of deal can be struck, then Mr. Trump might, as he said the other day, might become friends with Kim Jong-un. And he said that stranger things have happened. So what is the solution here? What is South Korea's strategy, which I think is the critical player in this three-way relationship? And that is for South Korea, should take the lead, not imitate Mr. Trump's maximum pressure, cutting off oil from China and all of that, in the hopes that North Korea will come to the denuclearization talks and give up its nuclear capabilities, but to carve out a role of its own that is much more proactive. And what I'd like to suggest here is that, first of all, the South Korean government make a clear division between family reunions, Isan Kajok, or Kaesong, or Kumgangsan, Kwangang, all of these kinds of things. These are basically issues for brothers to resolve among themselves, not between two states. They follow the relations between the two states. They don't lead. And then to leave to the foreign ministry and empower the foreign ministry to have talks with its counterpart in North Korea on a two-state solution basis with the U.S. Involved to try to find some final resolution to these issues. And I would suggest that the best way to do this would be through 2+2 talks, maybe on a track tube basis initially, where the U.S. and North Korea meet one day, and then South and North Korea meet the following day to talk about security matters, and then all three have a nice dinner together that evening. And this is not too far-fetched, because we've seen this happen actually twice before during the six-party talks when Ambassador Wee Sung-nak and Vice Minister Lee Young-ho met on the day after the U.S. and North Korea had met, once in Bali and once in Beijing. So it's not something that I've dreamt up. There's a precedent for this. And it seems to me that would be one way to go for South Korea, rather than follow the U.S. into the wilderness here, not in full recognition that the U.S. is actually promising a whole lot more than people know about, if that deal can be reached, and instead to propose a 2+2 strategy that is of its own making and for which it has the leadership. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, General Pan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am privileged to be here to share my views on the lessons that we should learn from our past failure to address the North Korea nuclear issue. I have prepared a talking point. I listed several lessons that I think that we should learn from our past experience. I was talking about the need to address the nuclear issue while working hard to reduce the tension in the peninsula. These are actually the two sides of one coin. And I was also talking about the need to strengthen international solidarity to address this nuclear issue. And particularly, we should prevent North Korea from being a piece of the chessboard of major powers competition. And I was also talking about the need to strengthen domestic public support to the national government's policy. But of course, all these are just common sense, nothing new. But sometimes common sense would find it very difficult to turn into policy or actions. So I think that we need to really remind ourselves of all these plain facts and plain truths. But what I would like to talk about in this time frame of 5 or 7 minutes time frame is I just to skip all these things that I mentioned. I try to highlight the role of South Korea in addressing the DPRK nuclear issue. Unfortunately, in my view, that we seem to lack a very robust, a very healthy, a very constructive role of South Korea in helping resolving the DPRK nuclear problem. I think that South Korea is a unique player in our game of addressing this nuclear issue. South Korea is part of the whole Korean nation. So South Korea should have a deeper understanding of the feelings and the sentiments of North. And South Korea is also an ally to the United States. At the same time, it's a strategic partner to China. So I think that South Korea could play a unique role in lubricating differences among all these parties. Could become a bridge to the differences of these parties and a very valuable coordinators of the efforts of all the parties involved in this exercise. I often had a kind of nostalgia feeling towards the time when President Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun pursued their sunshine policy. I understand the aim is to try to reach a kind of political reconciliation with the North, and so that a way could be paved for the resolution of a nuclear issue as well as the way for peaceful unification. I understand the sunshine policy may have had many flaws, and I understand this is a controversial issue in this country. But I think that the sunshine spirit should never be obedient. I think that the sunshine spirit should continue to play a role if South Korea wants to play a leading role in the security arrangements of the peninsula, and particularly eventual peaceful unification with the North. So during the time of President Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun, it was the time that there was a certain kind of detente between South and North. It was also the time that the six-party talks achieved some breakthroughs. I do not say that we need to copy this past policy, but I think that South Korea perhaps should reflect that to try to identify itself with the United States policy towards the North may have some kind of backfiring effect. And it will be more likely to drive North to be more determined to maintain its nuclear programs and make even more remote for the peaceful unification in the future. Now, in this regard, I try to respond to the questions just raised in the last panel discussion by our Thai colleague, who is a former foreign minister of Thailand. I think he raised a very important point, and that is, if we want to address the denuclearization of the peninsula, we need to think of the role of a nuclear umbrella. So what is the definition of denuclearization of the peninsula? Does it also should include the giving up a nuclear umbrella of South Korea? So I think that, to me, I think at least it should include some kind of modification of nuclear extended deterrence of the United States. It's not just simple as simple as North Korea abandoned its nuclear programs. And I think that all the other parties should also have due responsibility in order to have a full denuclearization of the peninsula.
Thank you very much. Would you wrap up, please, in a minute?
I stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And both Dr. Nam-Gung and General Pan emphasized the importance of South Korea taking the leading role. I think current administration, President Moon Jae-in government actually have tried in their own way. For example, President Moon offered a meeting to discuss the issue of establishing military hotline or South Korea's provision of some humanitarian aid, but actually there was no response from the North Korea at all. So I don't know how much range or room for South Korea has in that regard. And General Pan also presented an important, the same point, emphasizing the role of South Korea playing unique role. If North Korea has become very much dependent on South Korean economy rather than on the Chinese economy, probably we will be able to exercise our leverage on North Korea in influencing their decision making. Actually, it is China that North Korea is heavily depending on its trade relationship. China occupies 90% of North Korea's trade. So my question to General Pan is, what should be the China's role in this game of nuclear confrontation. I mean, you didn't mention much about China, even though China has been regarded by the international society probably the most important actor in this game. You don't have to answer right now, but probably in the later. And next, Minister Niam Osor, please.
Thank you very much. Since this session is about the lessons learned and devising new approaches, I think I should start by mentioning one of the lessons that we've learned over the past several years, and this is that the pressure hasn't worked to compel North Korea to abandon its nuclear and missile programs, and probably the pressure and more sanctions wouldn't compel North Korea to abandon these programs. This is one of the lessons I think we've learned. For example, the previous panelists on previous panels have talked about the 1994 agreed framework when North Korea, which was a time when North Korea didn't have nuclear weapons, but then since then we have left behind 20 or something years behind us, and then we're now talking about should we be talking about deterring nuclear North Korea. So, and over the course of those years, there have been, I think, 7 or 8 UN Security Council resolutions. There have been sanctions which got tougher and tougher, but still North Korea is where it is now. So this is one of the lessons, I think, and concerning devising new strategies, I think we should revert to old approaches, which is like the discussion that talks about the great framework and the six-party talks. We should revert to the old approach, which is that of talking to North Korea. I think there could be 2 tracks of talks between North Korea and South Korea, which means a resumption of the inter-Korean dialogue. And then there should be, I think, talks between North Korea and the United States, because since this is what the North Koreans say they want. And then I think there should be a resumption of the six-party talks as well, because there are quite a few parties involved in this crisis. So the six-party talks should be resumed, in my opinion. And the talks, I think, should. Someone mentioned about the talks not being negotiations, but they could be talks about negotiations, starting maybe negotiations. And then the most obvious topic that could be discussed, I think, is what appears realistically to be one of the first, the most feasible step towards denuclearization, which is the freezing of the North Korea's nuclear missile testing. And also, during these talks, acceptable compromises could be devised about addressing the security concerns of parties involved, including reducing the scale of the exercises that are being held by allies, South Korea and the United States. Concerning another part of the strategy should be, in my view, a more important role, a pivotal role that South Korea could assume in shaping the negotiated outcome. And South Korea, through cooperation, coordination, and diplomacy, could play a more meaningful role in shaping the outcome, in my view. And last Friday, I attended a conference on the new economic policy, a new economic map, which a conference at the Yonsei University, which was about the new northern policy by the President Moon Jae-in Administration, which is seems to be something which is still in progress. But then there has been discussion about some outlines of that policy, which is cooperation within the broader framework of Northeast Asia, in order to build, as the Minister for Unification has said, to build peace through cooperation. We're more used to words peace through strength, but then there was this talk about peace, building peace through cooperation. And I also think that there's part of this strategy by South Korea is President Moon Jae-in's expression of interest in meeting the North Korean leader if conditions are met. So there is a clear expression of the interest by South Korean government, I think, to engage North Korea if and when the North Koreans respond in a more positive way to the calls to restrain their programs, nuclear and missile programs. And then there is also one strategy. I think one other lesson that we've learned is that that much on the Korean Peninsula depends on how the major powers involved in this crisis, in this region, interact, because I think the absence of trust between the major powers in the region is one of the reasons that we have not been able to come to a meaningful solutions regarding the North Korean crisis. But I think there should be very clear understanding that there could not be a politically acceptable military solution to this crisis, and in order to come to a solution through peaceful means, I think what's important is cooperation and dialogue among major powers on how to resolve these issues, because I think we should be mindful of another peninsula at another time in history when this absence of alignment of interest among major powers led to a horrible war in Europe, which with unintended consequences. I think this should be one of the lessons that everybody should be mindful about. I think also there is one of the lessons is that we should be mindful also of the prospects for a nuclear non-proliferation, not only regionally but also globally, in the context of North Korea pursuing further their nuclear programs, because this could negatively affect the global non-proliferation regime. So this should be one area where the major powers, nuclear and non-nuclear weapon states, should be working together to devise the ways to make a Korean Peninsula a nuclear-free peninsula. And I think Peter and Morton have talked about the nuclear weapon-free Northeast Asia, and the scholars in Mongolia also have joined these discussions on nuclear weapon-free zone in Northeast Asia. So this should be one option that could be considered as a new strategy for the region. And I also think that talks through using track 1, track 2, and track 1.5 venues is also in one area that should be or should be used more. For example, Mongolia has hosted a number of track 1.5 to meetings within what's been called Ulaanbaatar dialogue. So this is, I think, something that should not be neglected. And scholars, experts, and government officials from the region should be, I think, more willing to talk together and about this and try to involve the North Koreans as well, because for these meetings in Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia, the North Korean experts tend to come, so there is this frank discussion of the issues. So this is one area that also I think should be used more extensively.
Would you please wrap
yeah,
up?
That's
Yeah.
I think I'm done.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And last but not least, Dr. Boronchov, please.
Dear Mr. Chairman, of course it's great privileges to present as the last one. And karena Chelmonjo, Chega 국립외교원 외교안보연구소 저를 이 아주 중요한 아주 높은 수준 학술 회의에서 참석하기 위하여 자기 아주 깊은 감사를 표시하려고 합니다.
Thank you.
Yes, I enjoyed a lot the presentation of my colleagues and agree with many top points of their assessments. And using this opportunity and maybe in continuation of General Pan presentation, I would like to divide with you my latest experience. 2 weeks ago, I visited North Korea, where I had many meetings, and the 2 meetings were in Foreign Ministry with director of 2 departments, and one it was the Institute of Disarmament and Peace. As you know very well, it's an analytical center in the Foreign Ministry of North Korea, dealing first of all with inter-Korean relations. And of course, I tried to persuade them that they should improve relations with the Republic of Korea and respond positively to President Moon Jae-in peaceful proposal. But their response was approximately the same. If you wanted some kind of message from Institute of Disarmament and Peace of North Korea, they told, of course, we are looking attentively to steps of President Moon Jae-in, and we hope for the best. But now, to our regrets, we can see that South Korea society in a whole and the expert society follows fully the United States and believes to the United States totally unconditionally. And maybe it's the reason why the South Korean public opinion and expert society failed to see the great gap in the threat perceptions inside of South Korea society and American society. America is changing, and not only because the new president, maybe a little bit inordinary one, came in power, but first of all because more and more Americans from different parts of society, liberal, conservative, Republican, Democrats, began to believe that if North Korea construct the missile capable to achieve American mainland, North Korea immediately and for sure, without fail, will inflict nuclear strike on the United States. And the United States is the real threat. And of course, North Korean guys told that it's stupidity. We never will attack the United States first, especially with nuclear weapons. We are not suicidal, and we understand it will be the last day of the North Korea. But these perceptions became reality in the United States, and more people in the United States believe that North Korea will inflict the nuclear strike on the United States. And this new reality changed the perception and estimation of risks and possible losses. what yesterday was accepted as unacceptable losses in the case of war, today became acceptable. And therefore, the United States can make the preemptive strike on North Korea in any moment, not asking South Korea, not asking even the US Congress permission. And after it, to ask some question will be too late. They give examples for what looks as the latest joint military drills. South Korean continue to tell that it's ordinary, usually maneuvers, and that in spite of the tension on the peninsula is permanent factors. Crises happen to be regularly, but war never happened. And just now, South Korea society believes that the Washington only tried to make pressure and to threaten North Korea, but in the very end will never start the war. But they told, look, the last maneuver, it's the real preparation for the preemptive strikes. Yes, Korea Peninsula geography peculiarity give no opportunity for the systematic, gradual accumulation of forces for the creation of the mighty striking force like it was in Yugoslavia or in Iraq. Therefore, United States military now using other tactics. In any kind of different military drill, they exercise specific element of the preemptive strike. 3 aircraft carrier together, and recently it was not the demonstration of power only. It was not threatening of North Korea. 3 aircraft carrier are not coming not just for show. They are exercises the coordination of movement and many, many other things. Or present vigilance ace aircraft or air forces exercises. How many stealth equipment, stealth technology, different type of aircraft were used in this maneuver. So many stealth aircraft also not flying to Korea, not just for show. According to their assessments, just now it's really, we have the contact reconnaissance. And they told that our soldiers for a long time are sleeping, not removing their boots. Situation is that the preemptive strike can take place in any moment. And they told that the war is really and loudly knocking at the door of Korean Peninsula, but South Korea society, public opinion, trying to neglect it or underestimate this real new reality and consider that everything is developing as usual. And they told, yes, we hope that President Moon Jae-in will do more independent steps, and we hope for more independent analysis and assessments on South Korean side. Of course, I asked about the Pyeongchang Olympic Games. They told, yes, we have nothing against the Pyeongchang Olympic Games, and we don't want to do something bad, to do harm for these Olympic Games, but this Olympic Games is a secondary element in the whole security situation. If the United States will do something aggressive from their point of view, we will respond immediately. Therefore, according to the Republic of Korea, they told we are wait, we are hope for more independent course of the present Mr. Moon Jae-in government. According to the United States, they told we are very strongly is going to the direction of the nuclear parity achievement with the United States. I told it sounds very ridiculous, amazement. What kind of nuclear parity you can achieve with the United States? They told we are diplomats, we are not military guy, we don't know exactly, only great leader know it well, but of course it will be some kind of specific asymmetrical nuclear parity, but we will achieve it by any case, and no any kind of sanctions will stop us. So the situation, from my point of view, is deteriorating dramatically. And in conclusion, according to my mind, the Chinese-Russian proposal of immediate, in the first stage, immediate decreasing of the military activity from both sides, and restarting as soon as possible all types of the talks and the dialogues between North and South, North and the United States, are not only very logical, but is becoming more and more urgent and urgent. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'd like to open to the floor for questions, and since we have just 10 minutes, I think I can get 3 questions from the floor. Yes. Yes, over there. Yes, first. Please identify yourself and make it clear to whom you are addressing your question, and no comment, just question, please.
Thank you for the presentations. My name is Bumjun Park, and I'm a lecturer at the Republic of Korea Air Force Academy. My question isn't directed towards a specific speaker, but to anyone who could provide the answer or a comment. I've been here since the opening session, and what I could gather is that in order for North Korea to even consider denuclearizing, we would need to be able to provide some sort of security to the North Korean regime. But my question is, how do you provide security to a hereditary authoritarian regime? To tackle a problem, it's often said that everyone needs to first recognize that there is a problem, but what if North Korea is actually content with the current tension? It is a pessimistic and a hypothetical thought, but what if North Korea is actually happy with having an external foe where the populace could rally around the flag against? Whereas without an external foe, the populace could rally against the regime. And isn't it possible that the regime might want to have nuclear weapons in such a situation to prevent external meddlings in its situation, like the Syria or the Libya case? Thank you.
The lady, yes.
Hello, thank you very much for a great conference, not just this panel. I am an academic based at the university in Brussels and currently a Korea Foundation visiting fellow at Seoul National University. So since I come from Europe, I will have a question about Europe. Because we've discussed all sorts of formats for negotiations, talks and whatever, but actually Europe or the European Union has never been mentioned. And I would actually argue that because Europe does not have direct stakes in the region, it could actually serve as a good mediator or chair of possible talks. Also because the EU has quite a substantive experience with chairing similar discussions, such as with Iran, or multilateral settings, say Paris Climate Treaty Agreement. And actually it has good relations with all the parties within the 6 talks, including some contacts with Pyongyang. So I would just be curious to know, any of the speakers, what would you think about this suggestion to get the EU involved a bit more as sort of a middleman between all the parties?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. One more, please. Yeah.
저 혹시 한국어로 질문해도 될까요?
예.
네, 강의 잘 들었습니다. 저는 이제 이름은 박희수고 대학생이라고 하는데요. 그 러시아 알렉산더 님에게 질문드릴 게 있는데, 최근에 한미연합 군사훈련이 선제 공격을 포함한다고 말씀하셨는데, 네, 우리나라도 자위권 차원에서 북한이 핵 발사가 임박했다고 느끼는 순간 그 핵시설을 미리 타격해야 할 자위권을 갖는데, 어떻게 그런 한미연합 군사훈련이 선제 공격을 한다는 구체적인 근거가 무엇인지 궁금하고, 이게 혹시 한미연합 군사훈련이 러중을 인식한 패권 경쟁의 하나의 일환으로 해석하셨는지 궁금합니다.
예, 알겠습니다. 감사합니다. Yes, I'd like to give each panelist 1 minute. Sorry for this, but I have to be strict in managing time. I was encouraged to do so by the organizer of this conference, and this time reverse order. Dr. Voronchov, you first.
Okay, thank you for very good questions. Of course, I understand very well the concern of South Korea public opinion in connection with the nuclear weapon and missiles progress in North Korea. It's changed military balance on peninsula, and of course, I understand the concern of South Korea very, very well. And the question deals with the classic perceptions and misperceptions. One side believes that it's measures of self-defense, and other sides accept it as aggressive actions, and vice versa. North Korean also pointed for me, yes, Republic of Korea insists that its self-defense measures this military drills necessary response to North Korea missile, nuclear developments, and etc. But at the same time, they pointed out, look, recently, in all types of the joint military exercises between the United States and the Republic of Korea, all types, Army, ground, Air Force, Naval, even undermarine, the goal of decapitation, the task of elimination of Kim Jong-un is included in the scenario of all types of the military joint maneuvers. Is it also not for chance, they told? Is it self-defense or it's a threat for our side? So the question is, of course, difficult. Once again, one side is sure it's legitimate self-defense measures, in other sides it accepted as aggressive steps, unfortunately.
Thank you. Minister Naimosoro, you have anything to comment on?
Well, maybe regarding the role of the European Union, maybe, just to say about the mediating role of the European Union. I would think that from the North Korean perspective, this wouldn't seem as a European Union talking to North Korea or to the players in the region, but more maybe as members of NATO. So I don't think that this could be a very conducive framework.
Thank you. General Pan.
I think for now, what is urgent is stop saying or doing anything that will fuel the tension in the peninsula. Stop trading, you see, those inflammatory words against each other. For North Korea, we hope that they will refrain from doing any testing, nuclear or missile. On the part of the United States and its allies, stop talking about deterrence, because deterrence in the eyes of the other side is just provocative. And they will have to consider to stop doing this kind of military exercises. So anyway, so both sides should do something to reduce the tension so as to prepare a more propitious kind of atmosphere in which the parties can approach in a talk.
Thank you. Dr. Namgo?
If I may venture a quick response to the question about the role of the EU. As you know, there have been many parties, both private organizations and governments, that have offered their mediation services and their good offices and so on to try to get a dialogue underway between North Korea and the U.S. The problem here is that there already is a dialogue, and it's very active. And so there's really no need for any party to come forward and to offer to facilitate the opening of a dialogue when one already exists. In the same way, there's really no need for track 2 talks at the moment, although I foresee a time when those talks will become very important once we reach the stage of actual negotiations on very, very difficult, thorny issues. The other aspect is, and I should add that many parties in the EU, and including the EU itself, have offered these services. The Germans are very concerned, the Italian foreign minister is concerned, the more or less neutral states of Switzerland, Sweden, and Norway are very concerned. Tony Blair's chief of staff, Jonathan Powell, recently led a very high-level EU delegation, met with Lee Soo-young, and were given a polite reception and said goodbye, basically. This is a matter between us and Washington. But as I said, those channels are wide open, and talks are going on. The question is that, as somebody pointed out earlier today, the negotiations themselves have not really started yet. And there, the EU and EU countries, I don't see any concrete proposals for breakthroughs and breaking the log jams and so forth coming forward, at least not yet.
Thank you. Professor Hayes?
The threats of preemptive strike are mutual and very unfortunate from both parties. North Korea, of course, has been venting the threat of preemptive nuclear strike against the United States, its allies, and I guess all the UN command allies as well, rather explicitly. It, of course, in the past has actually attempted to decapitate South Korea, not under Kim Jong-un's regime, but this is not completely inconceivable. And in fact, one of their propaganda machines published a video of the demolition of the Blue House. This is, to my mind, a very vicious game of propaganda on both sides, and South Korea leaking certain information about war planning which of course both sides undertake as a matter of responsible military planning, is just as dangerous as the North Korean statement. So both sides obviously need to desist and stand down from this kind of threat. There is a very easy American step once we get to the point of moving forward, which is to reinstate the missing in action joint recovery teams that were in North Korea from 1996 to, I can't remember the exact date, 2002, 2004, 2005, thank you, which was in effect a guarantee to North Korea. The United States has not sent a cruise missile with Kim Jong-un's name on it to decapitate North Korea, because presumably it's a reasonable assumption the United States would not attack North Korea with those teams on the ground. This is a very easy thing to do, and North Korea attempted to restart those teams a few years ago under the Obama administration and was spurned, but it could be done rather easily. With respect to the question about North Korea really not being interested in changing its current circumstances, I think the essence is of any security in a conflict situation, the essence is communicate, then coordinate actions, and then collaborate to create joint products that you share the benefits of, including security. And if you simply issue threats in both directions, then you will destroy what is left of security and create enormous risk. So I don't think North Korea feels secure. It may feel stable, but I do think it perceives threat, and those threats are real and need to be addressed for it to be more relaxed.
Thank you. Dr. Halperin?
I'll pass.
Thank you. Dr. John?
Yeah, I will answer that this security-based approach toward the DPRK. It's a common sense and a common understanding in the study of nuclear proliferation that the countries go nuclear because of these four factors mostly. First of all, security. Secondly, politics, prestige, and orientation of leadership or national identity. Among them also there is a consensus that the security matters most. So I think so far our approach toward the DPRK was more legalistic and institutional and normative. I think that's not enough. We need to have this more approach of security-based and interest-based approach toward the DPRK. I think this government and the US at the moment are saying that we don't care much about the DPRK regime or US system. We just care about these nuclear problems. I think what Korea was proposing about this regime building, it's more like proposing a peaceful coexistence on the peninsula. I think that's going to relieve DPRK's strong motivation going nuclear weapons. I don't think it's going to solve it, but I think it's going to be one of the very basics so that we can start with a new, more of a approach toward this denuclearization process.
Thank you very much, all. I think we had very rich and wide-ranging discussions, and all of you proposed a very, fresh and creative ideas from various aspects, and one of the premise that all of you seem to share seems to be that we treat North Korean leader as a rational person. This morning, Secretary Colin Powell mentioned that point. I think it is very important to achieve the goal, to practice all the ideas you suggested. It is important to treat a North Korean leader as a rational person, at least in terms of maintaining his own regime and his own political life. So I think that is very important, and that will prevent from us making misperception, misjudgment, which may escalate into an uncontrollable situation, unwanted accidental war. So I think it is important for us, all the international society, to send a kind of consistent signal that our goal is not regime change, not preventive war, but policy change. Denuclearization. And I don't know whether we, international society, as well as the U.S. government especially, could be effective in sending that kind of consistent signal to the North Korean leader. Anyway, thank you very much for your devotion to this very productive discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Please give a big round of applause to Professor Emeritus Yoon Young-won and the panelists.